The forests of North America stretched endless under a gray sky. Rivers coiled like silver serpents, lakes lay still as mirrors, and in the clearings, smoke curled from the lodges of nations that had lived here since time itself began. This was the Great Lakes region in the mid-18th century, a world of hunters, traders, and warriors. But into this world came an empire. Red-coated soldiers built forts where there had been only trees. The British, fresh from defeating the French in the 7 Years' War, now claimed the land once known as New France. With the stroke of a treaty thousands of miles away, entire nations were told they were now subjects of the British crown. Among the Ottawa people lived a man who refused to bow. His name was Pontiac. Little is known of his early years, like a shadow moving through the forest. Some say he was born around 1720, near the Ottawa River. Others say he grew up at the edge of the Maumee. But by the 1750s, Pontiac had become a respected war chief among the Ottawa, known for his courage, his eloquence, and his uncanny ability to unite people who had long fought one another. During the war between Britain and France, Pontiac had allied with the French, fighting alongside them at Fort Duquesne and other battles. He had seen the might of European armies up close. He had also seen their arrogance. When the war ended in 1763, the French withdrew, leaving their indigenous allies to face the British alone. The British, under General Amherst, cut back on the gifts and trade goods that had maintained fragile alliances. They treated the native nations not as partners but as conquered peoples. Resentment grew like a storm cloud. Sacred traditions were insulted, lands taken without treaty, promises broken. Pontiac, watching the British tighten their grip, knew the old ways were in danger. He began to speak to other chiefs, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Huron, Shawnee, Delaware. In council fires that burned into the night, he spoke of unity, of resistance, of driving the British back across the Great Lakes. He was more than a warrior, he was a visionary. He called upon the teachings of the prophets who warned that the nations must purify themselves, cast off European ways and return to the old customs. Only then could they summon the spiritual strength to fight. By the spring of 1763, Pontiac's words had become action. A secret confederacy was forming, a network of warriors and leaders ready to strike at British forts from the Ohio Valley to the Great Lakes. And at the center of this storm, like the eye of a hawk, was Pontiac himself, calm, determined, waiting for the signal to unleash the largest indigenous uprising North America had ever seen. The British, complacent in their forts, had no idea that war was about to erupt around them. The British forts rose like wooden teeth across the Great Lakes. They were small but well built, manned by disciplined soldiers in red coats. To the British officers, these forts were symbols of order and empire. But to Pontiac they were thorns in the flesh of his people, outposts of an invading power. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac chose his target, Fort Detroit, the largest British stronghold in the region. Its walls of timber and earthwork guarded a garrison of 120 soldiers and hundreds of civilians. If it fell, British control of the Great Lakes would crack open like a rotten tree. Pontiac's plan was as bold as it was subtle. He would enter the fort under the guise of peace, as if to hold a council with the commander, Major Henry Gladwin. Beneath his warriors' blankets, muskets and tomahawks would be hidden. At the signal they would rise, strike and seize the fort from within. On May 7, Pontiac and 300 warriors approached the gates. They wore their finest clothes, their faces painted with vermilion and black. The British allowed them in, suspecting nothing, or so they thought. But Gladwin had been warned. Some say a native woman loyal to the British revealed the plan. Others claim a British scout overheard the plot. As Pontiac stood before Gladwin in the council house, his warriors all around, the major's men stood ready, muskets loaded. Pontiac looked into Gladwin's eyes and saw that the element of surprise was gone. The plan had failed. Without a word, Pontiac and his warriors withdrew. But he did not give up. Outside the fort, in the thick woods, his army swelled, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Huron, and more, until hundreds of warriors encircled Fort Detroit like a living ring. For weeks they laid siege. British supply lines were cut, messengers intercepted. Muskets cracked in the night, arrows hissed over the walls. Women and children inside the fort cowered while soldiers peered over the palisade at the endless forest. Pontiac's camp was not chaos but order. He enforced discipline, forbidding unnecessary cruelty, holding councils to plan the next move. He tried to rally more tribes, sending runners to distant nations, urging them to rise. And they did. All across the Great Lakes, British forts were falling. Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, one after another, garrisons were wiped out or captured. War had spread like fire through dry grass. But Fort Detroit held. Despite hunger and fear, the British resisted. Reinforcements slipped through and the siege dragged on. Pontiac was patient, but time was no longer his ally. Still his name carried weight. To the British he was a phantom, striking everywhere, impossible to pin down. To his own people he was a leader, a strategist, a man who dared to stand against an empire at its height. And beyond the smoke of battle, another kind of war was being fought, a war of promises, betrayals, and shifting alliances that would decide not just the fate of Fort Detroit but of Pontiac himself. The summer of 1763 burned hot, and with it burned the flames of rebellion. What began as Pontiac's plan at Detroit had become a wildfire sweeping the British frontier. Tribes from Illinois to the Ohio Valley rose like a tide. Fort after fort, Sandusky, St. Joseph, Miami, Venango, fell under sudden attack. Entire garrisons were wiped out. Convoys of supplies vanished into the trees. British settlers fled eastward, their farms left to the wilderness. Across the Great Lakes, the redcoat uniform became a target. Ambushes on lonely roads, raids at dawn, river crossings where muskets cracked from hidden banks. The empire was bleeding. Yet Fort Detroit still held. Pontiac's siege dragged into months. Supplies were scarce but the British were stubborn. Reinforcements managed to slip past the blockade. Major Gladwin would not yield. He had turned the fort into a fortress of defiance. Inside Pontiac's camp, frustration began to grow. The warriors were brave but they were not soldiers of an empire. They had families, hunting grounds, and lives beyond the siege. Weeks became months and some began to drift away. The British meanwhile started to push back. In Pennsylvania, the colonial militia struck back with brutal force. Entire native villages were burned. In one infamous massacre, a mob of settlers calling themselves the Paxton Boys slaughtered peaceful Conestoga Indians in cold blood. Violence bred violence, and the frontier dissolved into chaos. By autumn, British strategy shifted. They sent General Bouquet with seasoned troops into the Ohio country. His campaign was harsh but it broke the momentum of the uprising. Pontiac, still at Detroit, began to feel the war slipping through his fingers. The French, once allies of the tribes, were gone. Their empire in North America shattered after the 7 Years' War. Some French traders whispered support but offered no troops, no cannons. Pontiac had hoped for a grand alliance that could drive out the British, but now he saw only scattered fires flickering against a vast empire. Yet even in retreat, his name struck fear. British officers spoke it with a mix of hatred and respect. Pontiac, the Ottawa war chief who had dared to unite nations. In the spring of 1764, the British advanced again, their discipline and numbers slowly grinding down resistance. Tribes began to make peace. The great uprising waned. Pontiac himself left Detroit, ending the siege after nearly a year. He had not taken the fort, but he had shown an empire that it was not invincible. For a brief, furious moment, the British frontier had trembled. But Pontiac's story was not yet over. Though his rebellion had failed, his name would echo, and in the shadows of the Great Lakes, betrayal was waiting. By 1765, the drums of war had fallen silent. The British had re-established their forts, their convoys, their presence. The uprising that bore Pontiac's name was now a fading echo. Tribes across the Great Lakes signed treaties one by one, accepting British terms in exchange for peace. Pontiac, once the storm of the frontier, now became a negotiator. He traveled from village to village, urging his people to accept the new reality, not because he had grown weak but because he knew when the fight was lost. Even his enemies admitted he had been the fiercest opponent they had faced since the fall of New France. In July 1766, at Fort Ontario, Pontiac himself signed a formal peace with British Superintendent Sir William Johnson. It was a cold ceremony. The war chief who had besieged Fort Detroit now clasped hands with the representative of the Crown. For some, it was an act of pragmatism. For others, it was betrayal. He still held influence but it was slipping. The grand coalition of tribes had broken apart. The French were gone. British forts dotted the land like scars. Pontiac, once a symbol of unity, was now a man without an army. He wandered, visiting the Illinois country, meeting old allies, trying to find a new role. He spoke of creating a permanent confederation of native nations, an idea ahead of its time. But the political winds had shifted. Younger chiefs saw him as a relic of a failed war. Traders whispered that the British feared him still. And then came betrayal. In April 1769, at Cahokia, near the Mississippi River, Pontiac attended a council of chiefs. He walked among strangers, perhaps unaware of the danger. In the shadows an assassin waited, a Peoria warrior hired or persuaded by rival interests. As Pontiac left the council, the blade struck. Some say it was a knife, others an axe. He fell to the earth without a word. The man who had shaken an empire was dead, not on a battlefield but in a dusty frontier town. His body was buried without ceremony. Yet his death sent a shockwave through the tribes. The British strengthened their grip. The dream of a united native confederacy dimmed. But the memory of Pontiac, the war chief who defied an empire, lingered like smoke over the Great Lakes. Later generations would call it Pontiac's War, though it was more than one man, more than one battle. It was a moment when history could have turned another way. His name became legend, a warning and an inspiration. Today towns, counties, even cars bear his name, Pontiac. Most have forgotten the man behind the word. But in the forest and the rivers where he once walked, his spirit endures, a reminder of the time when a leader rose from the wilderness and made the empire tremble.